Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 324, Raskol, the Schism within the Russian Orthodox Church. Last time, we finished the two-part series on the Third Moscow show trial held in 1938. Today, our topic goes back almost 300 years to the time when the Russian Orthodox Church faced an existential threat due to the proposed reforms of Patriarch Nikon in 1653, and this period is known as the Raskol. The schism within the Russian Orthodox Church that occurred in the mid-17th century was the only major split in the Church's history. The Catholic Church, of course, went through several schisms, the first major one being the split between them and the Orthodox Church in 1054. They also had a series of popes and anti-popes beginning in the 3rd century all the way into the 15th century. You also have the Protestant Reformation as well. Islam has had a few all along, with the most well-known being the split between the Sunni and the Shiite sects. As for the Russian Orthodox Church, there was the Central Church and those known as the Old Believers. There can be an argument made that Raskol, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, was a schismatic break, but that kind of stands on shaky grounds, as the main church was, for the most part, banned in the Soviet Union for many years. They've also reconnected, so that break really doesn't exist anymore. Even before the Romanovs' ascension to Muscovite tsardom, the Church attempted to implement reforms in the mid-16th century. These reforms, though, were more of a support of Ivan IV's policies and his numerous marriages than any real changes. After the time of troubles, new Tsar Michael established a commission to study the changes that had crept into church services and suggest any corrections that they deemed necessary. As Ryazanovsky and Steinberg write in their book, A History of Russia, quote, "But in the face of general ignorance, inertia, and opposition, little was done until Nikon became patriarch in 1652. Now, let's step back a bit before we get into this controversial person. The year is 1635, and a group of reformers known as the Zealots of Piety are reviewing the church service books as well as certain rites and practices. They believe that the previous time of troubles was a punishment by God for the lack of piety shown by both the Russian people and nobility. There were two times when the Russian Orthodox Church was under siege. Once, when the first false Dmitri converted to Catholicism, and the second, when the Catholic Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth occupied Moscow. This group, the Zealots of Piety, whose members included Fyodor Ritchev, Archimandrite Nikon of the Novospassky Monastery, who was the future Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia, Archpriest Ivan Neranov of the Kazan Cathedral, and Archpriest Avakum Petrov, who would become Nikon's fiercest enemy in the future. The Zealots of Piety were an interesting group that wanted to increase the power of the Russian Orthodox Church over the secular government. They believed the previous time of troubles was a message from God that the people, and as I mentioned before, and in particular, though, the ruling nobility, were deviating from their religion or their piety. Another issue of great importance to the group was the behavior of the clergy. A problem that persists to this day is the use of alcohol among some priests. Even in 2012, the Patriarch of the Church sent out an edict that priests must refrain from drinking alcohol around the time of the church service. Now, the Zealots of Piety wanted to rectify this problem back in the 17th century. Other issues they tried to tackle included church rituals during the liturgy that they believed deviated from the original Greek church. Nikon's ascension to the Patriarchate began the split within this group. He wanted wholesale changes to the church. But a schismatic group, later known as the Old Believers, was steadfast against them. As any member of the Russian Orthodox Church would know, rituals are an essential part of the religion, and the Old Believers couldn't bring themselves to agree with any of Nikon's reforms. One of the biggest changes that occurred was the correct way of making the sign of the cross. The Old Believers used 2 fingers, while the Reform required the use of 3. While this may seem trivial, it was a big deal to many of the faithful. As Feige states in his book, Natasha's Dance, A Cultural History of Russia, quote, "To the Western reader, it may appear to be about some obscure points of ritual that pale into insignificance when compared to the great doctrinal disputes of Western Christendom in the 16th and 17th centuries. But in Russia, where faith and ritual and national consciousness were so closely associated, the schism assumed eschatological proportions. As the Old Believers saw it, the reforms were the work of the Antichrist and a sign that the end of the world was near." I'd like to talk a little bit more about the use of 2 or 3 fingers to make the sign of the cross. Martin Sixsmith, in his book Russia, A 1,000-Year Chronicle of the Wild East, writes about a meeting he had with a priest, Father Pavel, who was head of a church that followed the old belief, although they don't use that term as they view themselves as the one true church. Father Pavel, when asked about his relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church after the fall of the Soviet Union, said, quote, "How can we have good relations with them? They have betrayed the truth of Christ. We are the only church that has remained constant, and those who remain constant will win salvation. How can anyone believe the sign of the cross should be made with 3 fingers like they do? Of course, it must be made with 2 fingers, as our Lord has taught us." Well, this is the conversation that was made over 300 years after Patriarch Nikon's reforms, which shows how strong the Raskol was and is to this day. Feige goes further when he writes, quote, "In many ways, the Old Believers remained more faithful than the established church to the spiritual ideas of the common people, from which they drew their democratic strength." The 19th century historian Pogodin once remarked that, if the ban on the old belief was lifted by the state, half the Russian peasants would convert to it. When it came to the selection of a new patriarch, Nikon was not the first choice of the clergy or the zealots of piety. They preferred Stefan Vonifatiev. But Nikon, born Nikita Minin, was the confessor of Tsar Alexis, so he made the decision. Having the backing of the Tsar was important, as it gave Nikon the support he needed to make the massive changes he felt necessary. Under Alexis, religion and moral revivalism flourished. Nikon used this as he felt he could ride the wave of populism, but it didn't work the way he thought it would. The liturgical issues were one of the first targets for reform. Things like the number of times the word hallelujah would be chanted during the service. Twice or 3 times were discussed. Some churches, their singing of evening vespers in the morning, while some would leave out parts of the service altogether. Now, Nikon and other members of the advisors that he called upon believed that a reversion to the Greek version of the text and rituals was the only way to go. Those opposed believed that the Russian version was the only true version and that any changes were heretical. The reactions to the reforms were monumental, to say the least. The average Russian peasant at the time was illiterate and had very little education. Many of the priests also had a poor education, and some were also barely literate. They hung on to tradition, which meant that any changes would disrupt their lives. Due to this hesitation to embrace the reforms mandated by Patriarch Nikon, in 1654, a Russian church council, along with the patriarchs of Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria, confirmed the changes. Another council, set up 2 years later in 1656, reaffirmed the reforms along with additional ones. This did not matter to many, as they continued using the same rituals as their fathers and grandfathers before them. One of the other major issues that really riled up both the priests and the people were the changes on how icons were being produced and used. The Greeks believed that the way the Russians were creating them deviated greatly from the ancient model and was influenced by Frankish and Western European Baroque influences. Nikon went so far as to order house-to-house searches for the supposedly, quote-unquote, heretical icons and have their eyes gouged out and paraded around the town in shame. Making things even worse, he ordered non-Byzantine churches to be demolished and rebuilt in the proper manner. Not everything Nikon did was limited to the reforms. He also constructed several monasteries, including the Valade Iversky Monastery, the New Jerusalem Monastery, and the Key Island Monastery. He also centralized the appointment of priests, taking this away from the local parishes and into the hands of the Moscow Patriarchate. One of the other reasons the Raskol grew in fervor was the outbreak of the plague in 1654. Many of the peasants, as I mentioned before, who were very suspicious, believed that the coming of this extremely virulent outbreak was a warning from God that he was unhappy with the reforms. It has been estimated that almost 80% of the population of Moscow died during this episode of the Black Plague. In the early years of his patriarchate, Nikon was more than just a leader of the Russian Orthodox Church. He was a partner of Tsar Alexis when it came to secular matters. During the wars with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1654 to 1667, when the Tsar was away, he gave Nikon reign over Russia. This would create a great deal of tension between the boyars and the patriarch. Nikon also wanted to create a separation between the church and the state, but with a clear notion of who the higher authority was, which was the patriarch. As he once proclaimed, quote, "There are two swords of authority, that is, the spiritual and the secular, and the supreme bishop is higher than the Tsar." Well, this last comment began a long spiral of distrust between him and Tsar Alexis. Before that, the Tsar would name Nikon as the godfather to all his children, of whom he had 13. One of the edicts that Alexis had promulgated earlier in 1649 by the acts of the Zemsky Sobor, as a replacement of the Sudebnik of 1550 introduced by Ivan IV of Russia, was the Sobornoye Ulozhenie, or Russian Legal Code of 1649. It would reduce the status of the clergy and make the church subservient to the state. Also, according to this code, the taxation of monastery lands was used for the benefit of the state. This would be the one thing that would make the relationship between Tsar Alexis and Patriarch Nikon take a turn for the worse. Well, Nikon had already angered the boyar class with his reforms and influence over Alexis, so they would begin a disinformation campaign against the patriarch. They also had a strong ally, the Old Believers. This group, now led by Archpriest Avakum Petrov and a few of the members of the Zealots of Piety. Although this uneasy alliance would not last long, as Alexei and other members of the church council would proclaim the Old Believers as heretical and begin a process of persecution that would last until the reign of Tsar Nicholas II, when he proclaimed the Edict of Toleration in 1905, releasing the Old Believers from exile and persecution. Before we get to the fallout between Tsar Alexis and Patriarch Nikon, I'd like to take some time discussing the reaction to the reforms by the people of Russia. It wasn't mild protests and the occasional rebellion. The reaction would, at times, rise to a whole other level. Self-immolation, burning oneself, would occur time and time again throughout Russia. It has been estimated that between 1671 and 1691, over 20,000 people burned themselves alive. There were over 37 communal conflagrations during the same period. Those who did not commit suicide would self-deport themselves. Some would head towards Siberia, others into the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as that government had laws protecting everyone's right to choose how they worshipped. Others would leave for North America, where the largest settlement of Old Believers today resides in Oregon. Persecution of the Old Believers began in earnest under Sophia, Peter the Great's half-sister. She would go after those deemed to be Raskolniki, or schismatics, having them burned at the stake unless they submitted to Patriarch Nikon's reforms. Our friend Archpriest Avakum, who I will one day dedicate an entire episode to, would be exiled to the city of Tobolsk in Siberia. This would last until after Nikon was removed from office in 1666. Avakum would wear out his welcome shortly thereafter and be exiled once again, this time to the far north in Mezin, near the White Sea. Allowed to attend the Church Council of 1666 to 67, he again refused to agree with the reforms. So then he was banished yet again to a town above the Arctic Circle in 1667. He would live the next 14 years in a pit or dugout where he would write his autobiography, The Life Written by Himself. Avakum would eventually be executed by being burned in a log cabin in 1682. Going back to Nikon, he was by now one of the most hated men in Moscow, with a significant target on his back. Nikon was more than a little bit opulent in his lifestyle, which began to irk the Tsar along with his violent way of enforcing these reforms. And this created a simmering anger among Russia's people, especially in Moscow. This ire made Tsar Alexis nervous, as he was still building his power base as the second Romanov Tsar. Alexis also was beginning to tire of Nikon's antics, but he was also concerned with the people's eschatological foreboding following the plague of 1654 and the appearance of a comet in the skies in 1655 and 56. For those unfamiliar with the term eschatological, which I was one, it means relating to death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul and of humankind. By 1658, advisors to the Tsar had finally convinced him that Nikon had to go, as he was asserting that his authority was superior to that of Alexis. Also, his violent means of enforcing the reforms were causing a great deal of anger amongst the people of Russia, and there was fear of rebellion, which would occur in 1670 through 71 during the Stenka Razin-led revolt. In 1658, Nikon decided to leave Moscow, staying at the New Jerusalem monastery, hoping to achieve the same response as Ivan the Terrible did when he left the capital. Nikon removed his patriarchal vestments, but did not resign as the head of the church. In 1667, a council of church elders tried and convicted Nikon of several charges. He was defrocked and lowered to the level of a monk. Nikon was then imprisoned at the far northern Feropontov monastery. At the same council, though, all of Nikon's reforms would be confirmed, and all those who opposed them, like Archpriest Avakum, would be anathematized. The majority of those who would continue on as Old Believers were Cossacks or peasants, although there was a following amongst some of the nobility. Two in particular were the sisters Boryanya Fedoyosa Morozova and Princess Evoktia Urosova. Both would be imprisoned in the underground cellar at the St. Paphnutius Monastery in Borovisk, where they would be effectively starved to death in 1675. An interesting tidbit is that Muscovite Russians made up the majority of Old Believers, with very few Ukrainians joining the movement. One reason is that Ukrainians of that time, especially the clergy, were far more educated than their Russian brethren. When Peter the Great came into power, he ordered men to shave the beards and dress in the Western style. Of course, this was unacceptable to the Old Believers. So they resurrected the Antichrist myth by naming Peter as their new enemy. Those who had the courage to resist his edicts were brave and devoted. In contrast, those who caved into the reforms were typically, as Steinberg and Ryazanowski put it, quote, the cowardly and the listless. They further added, quote, it certainly made it easier for Peter the Great to treat the church in a high-handed manner. Today, there are still many Old Believers around the world, with a small number in Russia. Communities of Old Believers exist throughout the United States, Canada, Australia, and South America. As to their numbers, I've seen estimates as low as 2 million and as high as 20 million. Whatever the number, they survive as very vibrant communities, still believing the old traditions and rituals of the pre-17th century Russian Orthodoxy. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time, and I promise it will be in 2 weeks and not this 3-week gap I just had. I just broke a molar and had some other technical difficulties, so I had to wait an extra week. We're going to discuss a topic that's a little controversial, especially in today's Putin's Russia, and that is the idea of Russian colonialism and imperialism, something that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov swore that Russia never did. But I'm going to provide evidence that shows quite the opposite of that claim. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.